A king's debt. Valeria Marchesi had been raised in luxury, untouched by the violence that kept her family in power. But when her brother betrayed Niccolò Moretti, she became the payment for his mistakes. The Sicilian capo traced a finger along her throat, his voice a quiet threat. "Your brother thought I wanted money," he murmured. "But I think you will do." Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage Cracks. The scent of orange blossoms, usually a comfort, felt cloying, suffocating. Valeria Marchesi traced the delicate pattern of the Limoges porcelain teacup, the china as fragile as she felt. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the solarium, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent mockery of the turmoil churning within her. Outside, the manicured gardens of the Villa Marchesi stretched towards the shimmering Tyrrhenian Sea, a picture of idyllic Sicilian beauty. But beauty, Valeria had learned, could be a deceptive veil. She hadn't seen her brother, Marco, in 3 days. 3 days since the hushed, frantic phone call from her father, his voice strained with a fear she'd rarely heard. "Stay at the villa, Valeria. Do not leave. I will handle this." Handle what, he hadn't said. But the unspoken hung heavy in the air, the Morettis. The Moretti family. Even the name tasted of danger, of ancient vendettas and blood feuds that stretched back generations. They controlled the western coast of Sicily, their power a dark undercurrent to the island's sun-drenched charm. The Marchesis, her family, controlled the east. An uneasy truce had existed between them for decades, a delicate balance maintained through carefully negotiated agreements and, Valeria suspected, a healthy dose of fear. Her father, Don Alessandro Marchesi, had always shielded her from the harsher realities of their world. She'd been raised in a cocoon of privilege, her days filled with lessons in art, music, and languages, the accomplishments of a proper Sicilian lady. The family business was a vague entity, spoken of in hushed tones, its details kept firmly out of her reach. She'd been content, or at least, she'd told herself she was. Now, the gilded cage was cracking. A shadow fell across the sunlight, and Valeria looked up to see her aunt, Isabella, her father's younger sister. Isabella was a striking woman, her silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent. Unlike Valeria's mother, who embraced the role of the demure Don's wife, Isabella was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who understood the intricacies of the family's power and wielded it with a quiet ruthlessness. "Valeria," Isabella said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. "Your father has requested your presence in his study." Valeria's heart hammered against her ribs. "Do you know what this is about, Zia?" Isabella's lips thinned. "It's about Marco. And a miscalculation." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Marco, her impulsive, reckless older brother, had always been prone to miscalculations. He craved the power and respect that came with their family name but lacked the patience and cunning to wield it responsibly. "What kind of miscalculation?" Valeria pressed, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella hesitated, her gaze sweeping over Valeria, assessing, calculating. "The kind that requires compensation." Compensation. The word chilled Valeria to the bone. She knew what that meant in their world. It meant deals brokered in blood, debts paid in loyalty, and sometimes in lives. She rose, her legs trembling slightly, and followed Isabella through the silent, opulent hallways of the villa. The portraits of her ancestors, stern-faced men and women in elaborate frames, seemed to watch her, their eyes filled with a silent judgment. She'd always felt a disconnect from them, from the legacy of power and violence they represented. Now, she felt like she was being drawn into their world, a world she'd never wanted to be a part of. The study was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather-bound books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and cigar smoke. Her father stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that aged him beyond his years. He turned as they entered, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a profound sadness that made Valeria's breath catch in her throat. "Valeria," he said, his voice hoarse.
"Come in, my dear."
He gestured to a chair opposite his massive desk. Valeria sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Isabella remained standing, a silent sentinel by the door. Marco has angered Niccolò Moretti, her father began, choosing his words carefully. He attempted to encroach on Moretti territory. A foolish, reckless act. Valeria's mind raced. Niccolò Moretti. The name was legendary, whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He was the head of the Moretti family, a man known for his ruthless ambition and his unwavering adherence to the old codes. He was also, by all accounts, devastatingly handsome, a man who could charm the birds from the trees and then crush them in his fist without a second thought. What happened? Valeria asked, her voice trembling. Her father sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Marco attempted to skim profits from a Moretti-controlled shipping operation. He thought he could get away with it. He was wrong. And Niccolò Moretti, he wants compensation, Valeria said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Her father nodded, his gaze meeting hers. He does. And he has specific demands. A cold dread washed over Valeria. She knew what was coming. She could see it in her father's eyes, in the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. He doesn't want money, Valeria, her father said, his voice breaking. He wants you. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the scent of the orange blossoms that now seemed to mock her with their sweetness. Valeria stared at her father, her mind reeling. She was the price. The payment for her brother's stupidity. She was to be handed over to Niccolò Moretti, a man she'd never met, a man who represented everything she feared and despised. Her carefully constructed world, the world of privilege and protection, had shattered. And in its place stood a terrifying new reality, a reality where she was nothing more than a pawn in a deadly game. A sob escaped her throat. This could not be happening. Papa, she whispered, there must be another way. Her father's face looked ancient, carved with the guilt of 1,000 unspoken deals. He moved, and for a moment, Valeria thought he was going to go to her, hold her, tell her it would all be fine. But he sat heavily in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. There is no other way, Valeria, he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that mirrored her own. This is the only way to avoid a war. The only way to protect the family. The only way to protect Marco. Her brother, the cause of all this. The selfish, reckless brother she had always secretly resented, despite her familial love. Isabella stepped forward, her voice sharp. It is your duty, Valeria. You must accept this. Duty. The word echoed in Valeria's mind. Duty to her family, to the legacy of the Marqueses. A legacy she'd never wanted, a legacy that was now demanding her sacrifice. She looked at her father. No tears ran down her face, but her heart cracked and splintered inside her chest. When? Valeria asked, her voice now cold. He will be here tomorrow evening. To collect his due. Her father replied, unable to look her in the eye. Valeria, finally, felt the tears fall. Silent, hot, and full of rage. She stood up and faced the window, the beautiful, deceitful view stretching in front of her. Tomorrow, her life ended, and another began. A life she did not ask for, and could never have imagined. But even as she stood at the edge of this precipice, a tiny spark of defiance ignited within her. She was a Marquese, and even in this, her darkest hour, she would find a way to survive. She would find a way to something. She did not yet know what. But the seed had been planted. She turned back to her father and aunt. She had composed herself. I will be ready, she stated, before turning and leaving the room. Every ancestor's portrait, every polished inch of floor, every object reflecting her image, mocking her. And what stung most was that she had known, deep down, that this day would come. One way or another. She would be ready. But what would ready even look like? That question spun, unanswered, haunting Valeria as she climbed the grand staircase, a prisoner in her own home, with no clear path to escape. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past Unveiled. The hours passed in a blur of numb disbelief. Valeria moved through the villa like a ghost, the familiar surroundings now alien and hostile. She packed a single suitcase, choosing clothes mechanically, her mind unable to grasp the reality of her impending departure. Each garment, each carefully chosen accessory, felt like a relic from a life that was no longer hers. She avoided the staff, their pitying glances and hushed whispers a constant reminder of her predicament. The loyal retainers, who had served her family for generations, now looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and fear. She was a sacrifice, a lamb being led to the slaughter, and they all knew it. Dinner was a silent, agonizing affair. Her father barely touched his food, his gaze fixed on his plate, avoiding her eyes. Isabella, ever the pragmatist, attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but even her usual composure was strained. Marco was, predictably, absent. Valeria had sent a message demanding to see him, but he had not responded. Coward. After dinner, Valeria retreated to her private sanctuary, a small, walled garden hidden behind the villa. It was a place of quiet beauty, filled with fragrant roses, jasmine, and ancient olive trees. She'd spent countless hours here as a child, escaping the confines of the villa, dreaming of a life beyond its walls. Now, those dreams seemed like a cruel mockery. She sat on a stone bench, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on her arms. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows across the garden. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones. A sound, the soft crunch of gravel, made her turn. Isabella stood at the entrance to the garden, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. "Valeria," she said, her voice softer than usual. "May I join you?" Valeria nodded, unable to speak. Isabella sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the olive trees. "I know this is difficult," Isabella said finally, her voice low. "But you must understand, your father is doing what he must to protect the family." "Protect Marco," Valeria corrected, her voice bitter. "He is protecting Marco, not the family. I am the one being sacrificed." Isabella sighed. "Marco is the heir. He is the future of the Marchesi family. And what am I?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling. "A bargaining chip? A piece of property to be traded?" Isabella reached out and took Valeria's hand, her grip surprisingly gentle. "You are Marchesi, Valeria. And that means something. It means strength, resilience, and a duty to your family, even when it demands sacrifice." "Duty," Valeria spat the word. "I am tired of duty. I have always done my duty. I have been the perfect daughter, the obedient niece. And where has it gotten me?" Isabella squeezed her hand. "I know it seems unfair, Valeria, but this is the way of our world. We do not always have the luxury of choosing our own paths." "But Nicolò Moretti, he is a monster," Valeria whispered, her voice filled with fear. Isabella's expression hardened. "He is a powerful man, Valeria. A dangerous man. But he is also a man of his word. He will honor the agreement. You will be safe." "Safe?" Valeria laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "How can I be safe with a man like that?" A man who— she couldn't finish the sentence. The image of Nicolò Moretti, the ruthless capo, too terrifying to contemplate. Isabella leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Nicolò is not without his vulnerabilities. He has a past, Valeria. A past that haunts him." Valeria looked at her aunt, intrigued. "What past?" Isabella hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "His mother, she was not Sicilian. She was English. He was very young when she was not taken. He was devoted to her. And her death, it changed him. It made him the man he is today." Valeria frowned. "Taken? What do you mean?" "She was killed," Isabella said bluntly. "Murdered. By a rival family. The details are unclear. But it was a brutal death. And Nicolò, he witnessed it." Valeria felt a flicker of something other than fear. Pity? Curiosity? She wasn't sure. The image of a young Niccolò Moretti witnessing his mother's murder was a stark contrast to the ruthless image she'd held. He has never forgotten it, Isabella continued. He carries the weight of that loss, that betrayal, every day. It is his driving force, his weakness, and his strength. And how does this help me? Valeria asked, her voice still trembling.
Isabella smiled. A sad, knowing smile.
It means he is not invincible, Valeria. He is human. He has a heart, however buried it may be. And that is something you can use. Use? Valeria repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. You are intelligent, Valeria. And you are beautiful. You have weapons at your disposal. Use them. Understand him. Find his weaknesses. And survive. Isabella's words were both chilling and empowering. She was suggesting that Valeria play a dangerous game, a game of manipulation and seduction. But she was also offering her a glimmer of hope, a way to navigate the treacherous waters she was about to enter. I don't know if I can, Valeria whispered, her doubts resurfacing. Isabella squeezed her hand again. You can, Valeria. You are stronger than you think. You are a Marchese. And you will not be broken. Isabella stood, her silhouette once again framed by the moonlight. Think about what I have said, Valeria. And remember you are not alone. She turned and walked away, leaving Valeria alone with her thoughts. The moon seemed to shine brighter now, illuminating the garden with a cold, stark light. The shadows still danced, but now they seemed less menacing, more intriguing. Valeria looked down at her hands, at the delicate veins that pulsed beneath her skin. She was a Marchese. She was a pawn. But she was also a woman. And she had a will to survive. She thought of Niccolò Moretti, the man who was about to become her captor, her husband, perhaps. The man with the haunted past, the man who had witnessed his mother's brutal murder. The man who was, according to Isabella, not invincible. A new feeling, a dangerous, thrilling feeling, began to stir within her. Fear was still there, but it was mingled with something else, a sense of defiance, of determination. She would not be a passive victim. She would not be broken. She would play the game, and she would play it to win. She would learn Niccolò Moretti's secrets. She would find his weaknesses. And she would use them to survive and, perhaps, even to find her own freedom. The thought, however audacious, sent a shiver down her spine. But it was a shiver of anticipation, not fear. The game had begun, and Valeria Marchese was ready to play. Or so she hoped. The uncertainty remained. But tonight, something in her had definitively shifted. And that was enough, for now, to cling on to. Even if, tomorrow, everything she knew would irrevocably change. The night deepened, the shadows lengthening. And in the silence of her walled garden, a silent vow took shape. A vow to survive. At any cost. Chapter 3. A debt demanded in flesh. The next day dawned with a cruel, relentless brightness. Valeria awoke with a heavy feeling in her chest, the events of the previous day crashing down on her with renewed force. She dressed slowly, choosing a simple black dress, its severity mirroring her mood. There would be no pretense of celebration, no attempt to soften the blow. This was a transaction, a transfer of ownership, and she would meet it with a cold, stark honesty. She refused breakfast, the thought of food making her stomach churn. She paced her room, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She tried to focus on Isabella's words, on the idea of finding Niccolò Moretti's weaknesses, of playing the game. But the fear was a constant, gnawing presence, threatening to overwhelm her. She jumped at the sound of a car approaching the villa, the low rumble of its engine echoing through the silent house. This was it. He was here. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She walked to the window, her legs trembling slightly. A sleek, black car pulled up to the front entrance, its windows tinted, obscuring its occupants. Two men emerged, both dressed in dark suits, their faces impassive. They were bodyguards, clearly. Then, the rear door opened, and he stepped out. Niccolò Moretti. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. He was even more striking than the rumors had suggested. Tall and powerfully built, he moved with a predatory grace, his presence dominating the scene. He was dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. His hair was black, thick and slightly wavy. His eyes, even from this distance, were a piercing, intense blue. His face was a study in contrasts, handsome and hard, with a strong jawline and a sensual mouth that hinted at both cruelty and passion. He looked up at the villa, his gaze sweeping over the windows, and for a moment, Valeria felt as if he were looking directly at her. She quickly stepped back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She forced herself to move, to walk towards the door. She had to face him. She had to show him that she was not afraid, even if it was a lie. She descended the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. Her father and Isabella were waiting for her in the entrance hall, their faces grim. Marco was, again, conspicuously absent. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the front door opened, and Niccolò Moretti entered the villa. The two bodyguards flanked him, their hands resting discreetly inside their jackets, a clear indication of the weapons they carried. The air in the hall thickened, the tension palpable. Valeria stood frozen, her gaze fixed on Niccolò. He stopped a few feet away from her, his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Valeria Marchesi," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine. It was a voice accustomed to command, to obedience. It was not unpleasant, but undeniably dangerous. Valeria met his gaze, forcing herself to hold his stare. "Niccolò Moretti," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know why I am here." It was not a question. "I do," Valeria said, her voice cold. He gestured towards the door. "Then let us not waste time." Valeria turned to her father, her heart aching. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. He couldn't speak, couldn't offer her any words of comfort. He simply nodded, a silent farewell. Isabella stepped forward and embraced Valeria, her hug surprisingly fierce. "Be strong," she whispered in her ear. "Remember what I told you." Valeria nodded, clinging to her aunt's words like a lifeline. She pulled away from Isabella and walked towards Niccolò, her head held high. He offered her his arm, a gesture of courtesy that felt more like a claim of possession. Valeria hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand on his arm, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. His arm was hard, muscular, a tangible reminder of his power. They walked out of the villa, into the bright sunlight. The car was waiting, its engine running. Niccolò opened the rear door for her, and Valeria climbed inside, sinking into the plush leather seats. He followed, closing the door behind him, plunging them into a dim, intimate space. The car pulled away from the villa, leaving behind everything Valeria had ever known. She looked back at the house, at the only home she'd ever had, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, refusing to show any weakness. Niccolò watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. He simply observed her, his blue eyes intense and unwavering. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Valeria felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, trapped in this small, enclosed space with this dangerous, unpredictable man. Finally, Niccolò spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "Your brother was a fool," he said, his tone flat. Valeria didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. "He thought he could cheat me," Niccolò continued. "He thought he could get away with it. He underestimated me." "He underestimated the consequences," Valeria said, her voice low. Niccolò turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "And you? Do you underestimate me, Valeria?" Valeria met his gaze, her heart pounding. She knew she was walking a tightrope. One wrong word could send her plummeting into the abyss. "I know you are a powerful man, Niccolò Moretti," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I know you are not to be trifled with." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. And yet, here you are, trifling with me. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so challenging. I am here because of my brother's actions, she said, her voice firm. I am here to fulfill the agreement. The agreement, Nico Lowe repeated, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. You make it sound like a business transaction, isn't it? Valeria asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. Nico Lowe leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, a mixture of expensive cologne and something darker, more primal, filled her senses. It is whatever I choose it to be, Kara, he whispered, his voice a low, seductive murmur. And right now I choose it to be something more. His gaze dropped to her lips, and Valeria felt a shiver of fear, mingled with a strange, unexpected thrill. She was playing with fire, she knew, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. She was trapped, but something in her, that defiant spark, was refusing to be snuffed out. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even her, that this was only the beginning. The car sped on, carrying her further and further away from her old life and deeper into the unknown. And all she could do was hold on and prepare for the ride. Because whatever Niccolò Moretti had planned for her, she knew it would be anything but predictable. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. But also, perhaps, the most intriguing. The duality of her feelings was a constant, unsettling hum. And it was only growing stronger. Chapter 4. Whispers across the palazzo. The drive was long and silent, the Sicilian countryside blurring past the windows. Valeria stole glances at Niccolò, trying to decipher the man who now held her fate in his hands. He remained an enigma, his face a mask of controlled power, his eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. They finally arrived at a sprawling palazzo, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was an imposing structure, built of ancient stone, its walls weathered by centuries of sun and salt spray. This was Niccolò's home, his fortress, and Valeria felt a renewed sense of apprehension as they approached. The car stopped before massive wooden doors, intricately carved with scenes of mythical creatures and ancient battles. The doors swung open, revealing a courtyard filled with fountains, statues, and lush vegetation. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty, but Valeria couldn't shake the feeling of being a prisoner in a gilded cage. Niccolò escorted her inside, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. The interior of the palazzo was even more opulent than the exterior, with soaring ceilings, marble floors, and walls adorned with priceless artwork. It was a testament to the Moretti family's wealth and power, a world far removed from the quiet elegance of the Villa Marchesi. Servants appeared, bowing their heads in deference to Niccolò. They were silent and efficient, their movements almost invisible. Valeria felt their eyes on her, assessing, curious, but they offered no warmth, no welcome. Niccolò led her through a series of grand rooms, each more lavish than the last. He didn't speak, didn't explain anything, simply moved through his domain with an air of quiet authority. Valeria felt like an intruder, a stranger in a strange land, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and unspoken rules. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, intricately inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Niccolò opened them, revealing a spacious, elegantly appointed bedroom. This, it seemed, was to be her room, her prison. "This will be your sanctuary," Niccolò said, his voice breaking the silence. The word sanctuary felt ironic, given the circumstances. Valeria stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the room. It was beautiful, undeniably, with a large four-poster bed draped in silk, antique furniture, and a balcony overlooking the sea. But it felt cold, impersonal, lacking any sense of warmth or personality. "I will leave you to settle in," Niccolò said, his eyes lingering on her. "Dinner will be served at 8. Do not be late." He turned and left, closing the doors behind him, leaving Valeria alone in her new, opulent prison. She walked to the balcony, her legs trembling slightly. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of the sea stretching out before her, the horizon a hazy line between water and sky. But the beauty couldn't dispel the sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in this unfamiliar world. She leaned against the railing, her hands gripping the cool stone. She closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts, to make sense of her new reality. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also a Marquesi. And she would not be defeated. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the sea. She would learn the rules of this new world. She would observe, she would listen, and she would find a way to navigate the treacherous currents that surrounded her. She spent the afternoon exploring her room, examining the details, trying to find some sense of familiarity in the unfamiliar. She found a small library, filled with leather-bound books, and a writing desk, stocked with fine stationery. These were small comforts, but they were welcome. As the hours passed, Valeria began to hear whispers, snippets of conversations carried on the air. The servants, though discreet, were not entirely silent. She heard them talking about her, about La Marquesi, the woman who had been brought to the palazzo as payment for a debt. She learned that Niccolò was rarely at home, that he spent most of his time traveling, attending to business. She learned that he was feared and respected, that his word was law within the palazzo. She learned that he had few close friends, that he kept himself isolated, surrounded by his loyal guards and his carefully chosen staff. She also learned that he had never married, that there had been no woman in his life, at least not publicly. This surprised her, given his power and his undeniable attractiveness. It also fueled her curiosity. What was it about this man, this ruthless capo, that made him so solitary? As the time for dinner approached, Valeria felt a growing sense of anxiety. She knew she would be facing Niccolò again, that she would be subjected to his scrutiny, his silent judgment. She chose a dress carefully, a deep blue silk that emphasized her figure without being overtly provocative. She wanted to project an image of strength and confidence, even if it was a facade. She descended the grand staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the dining room, a vast, formal space with a long, polished table that could easily seat 20 people. Only 2 places were set, one at each end of the table. Niccolò was already there, standing by the window, a glass of wine in his hand. He turned as she entered, his eyes sweeping over her, assessing. "You are punctual," he said, his voice neutral. "I appreciate that." Valeria didn't respond, simply took her seat at the opposite end of the table. The distance between them felt vast, symbolic of the gulf that separated their worlds. Servants appeared, silently serving the first course, a delicate antipasto of seafood and vegetables. Valeria picked at her food, her appetite gone. Niccolò ate with a quiet efficiency, his gaze fixed on her. "So," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Tell me about yourself, Valeria Marquesi." Valeria met his gaze, forcing herself to hold his stare. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Tell me about your life, your family, your dreams." Valeria hesitated. She knew she was being tested, that every word she spoke would be weighed and measured. She decided to be honest to a point. She told him about her sheltered upbringing, about her love of art and music, about her dreams of traveling the world. She omitted any mention of her resentment towards her family, towards the constraints of her life. She painted a picture of a contented, privileged young woman, a woman who had accepted her fate with grace and dignity. Niccolò listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. He asked questions, probing, insightful questions that forced her to reveal more of herself than she intended. "And what about love, Valeria?" he asked, his voice soft. "Have you ever been in love?" Valeria felt her cheeks flush. She had never been in love, not in the romantic sense. She had had crushes, fleeting infatuations, but nothing that had touched her heart. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Niccolò smiled, a knowing smile. "Perhaps that will change," he said, his voice laced with a hint of something more. The rest of the dinner passed in a similar vein, a carefully choreographed dance of questions and answers, of veiled truths and unspoken emotions. Valeria felt as if she were walking a tightrope. One wrong step could send her plummeting into the abyss. As the meal ended, Nicolo rose from his chair. "I have some business to attend to," he said. "I will be gone for a few days." Valeria felt a flicker of relief, a brief respite from the constant pressure of his presence. "When will you return?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "When my business is concluded," he said, his voice enigmatic. "Do not worry, Cara. You will be well looked after." He turned and left the room, leaving Valeria alone with her thoughts. The whispers of the palazzo seemed to swirl around her, carrying secrets, hinting at dangers, offering glimpses of a world she was only beginning to understand.
She was a prisoner, yes.
But she was also a survivor. And she was beginning to learn the rules of the game. A game that was far more complex and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And a game, she realized, she could not afford to lose. Because the stakes were higher than she had ever dreamed. Her life. And, perhaps, something even more precious. Her heart.
The thought was terrifying. And exhilarating.
And it left her staring into the empty space where he had stood, feeling utterly, completely alone. But not defeated. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Lion's Den Unveiled. Nicolo's absence was a strange mix of relief and unease. Valeria had the run of the palazzo, but the freedom felt illusory. She was still a prisoner, albeit one with a larger, more opulent cell. She explored the vast house, discovering hidden courtyards, a vast library filled with ancient texts, and a music room with a grand piano that beckoned her to play. She spent hours in the library, losing herself in the pages of old books, finding a temporary escape from her predicament. She discovered a hidden passage behind a bookshelf, leading to a small, secret garden, a place of quiet beauty that felt like her own private sanctuary. She also began to interact more with the staff, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. She learned their names, their stories, their roles within the intricate hierarchy of the Moretti household. She discovered that beneath their surface of silent obedience, there were currents of fear, loyalty, and resentment. She was particularly drawn to an older woman named Sophia, the head housekeeper, a woman with kind eyes and a quiet strength. Sophia had served the Moretti family for decades, and she knew all the secrets of the palazzo, all the stories of its inhabitants. "You are different, Signorina Marchesi," Sophia said to her one afternoon as they sat together in the kitchen, sharing a cup of strong, sweet coffee. "You are not like the others." Valeria frowned. "What others?" Sophia hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. There have been women in the Don's life, but they were different. They were afraid. Or they were ambitious, seeking to use his power for their own gain. "And I am not?" Valeria asked, her voice low.
Sophia smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
"You are curious. You are observing. You are learning. You are not afraid to ask questions." "Should I be afraid?" Valeria asked, her heart pounding.
Sophia's gaze met hers.
"The Don is a dangerous man, Signorina. He has enemies. He has secrets. But he is also a man of honor. He will keep his word." "His word," Valeria repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "His word that I am his property." Sophia sighed. "It is the way of our world, Signorina. The way of the families. But there are ways to navigate. To survive." "Isabella told me the same thing," Valeria said, remembering her aunt's words. "She told me to find his weaknesses." Sophia's eyes widened slightly. "Your aunt is a wise woman. But be careful, Signorina. Nicolo is not easily fooled. He is perceptive. He sees more than most." "I am beginning to realize that," Valeria said, thinking of his intense gaze, his probing questions. "He has a sadness in him," Sophia continued, her voice low. "A darkness. From his past. From his mother." Valeria remembered what Isabella had told her about Nicolo's mother's murder. "Tell me about his mother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia hesitated, then began to speak, her voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and respect. She told Valeria the story of Eleanor, Nicolo's English mother, a woman of beauty and spirit who had captured the heart of the previous Don Moretti. She told her of their passionate love, of their unconventional marriage, and of the jealousy and resentment it had sparked within the family. She told her of Eleanor's brutal murder, of the young Nicolo witnessing the horrific event, of the trauma that had scarred him for life. She told her of his vow of vengeance, of his relentless pursuit of his mother's killers, of his transformation into the ruthless, unforgiving man he was today. Valeria listened, her heart aching for the young boy who had lost his mother, for the man who had been shaped by that loss. She began to understand the darkness that haunted him, the sadness that lay beneath his surface of control. He loved her very much, Sophia said, her voice filled with emotion. He has never forgotten her. He keeps her memory alive in his heart. And has there been anyone else? Valeria asked, her voice hesitant. Has he ever loved another? Sophia shook her head. There have been women, yes. But no one who has touched his heart. No one who has seen past the darkness. Valeria felt a strange, unexpected pang of something. Pity? Empathy? She wasn't sure. But the image of Nicolo, the solitary, haunted man, began to shift in her mind. He is not a monster, Signorina, Sophia said, her voice firm. He is complex. He is wounded. But he is not a monster. Valeria nodded, her thoughts swirling. She was beginning to see Nicolo in a new light, not just as her captor, but as a man with a past, a man with vulnerabilities, a man who was, perhaps, capable of feeling. The realization was both unsettling and intriguing. It added a new layer of complexity to the game she was playing, a game that was becoming increasingly dangerous, increasingly personal. As the days passed, Valeria continued to explore the palazzo, to learn its secrets, to observe its inhabitants. She spent hours in the music room, playing the piano, finding solace in the music, expressing her emotions through the keys. She also began to anticipate Nicolo's return, her feelings a confusing mix of fear and anticipation. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. She was drawn to him, to his darkness, to his hidden vulnerabilities. She was walking a tightrope, she knew, but she was also beginning to find her balance. And she was beginning to realize that the game she was playing was not just about survival. It was about something more. Something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Something that was changing her, transforming her, in ways she could never have imagined. And as she waited for Nicolo's return, she knew that the next chapter of her life would be the most challenging, the most dangerous, and the most transformative yet. The lion's den was unveiled. But she was no longer a frightened lamb. She was something else. Something more. And she was ready to face him, on her own terms. Or so she hoped, with a renewed sense of determination and a growing, unsettling awareness of the man she was bound to. The anticipation was a palpable thing, a weight in the air. And it was only growing heavier. Chapter 6. Masks of Civility and Deceit. Nicolo returned late one evening, his arrival unannounced, his presence immediately felt throughout the palazzo. Valeria was in the library, reading, when she heard the faint sound of his car approaching. She closed her book, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had been both dreading and anticipating this moment, her emotions a tangled mess of fear and something else. She rose and walked to the window, watching as his car pulled up to the front entrance. He emerged, his silhouette framed by the lights of the palazzo, his face unreadable in the shadows. He moved with his usual predatory grace, his presence dominating the scene. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had to be strong, composed. She had to show him that she was not afraid, even if it was a lie. She left the library and walked towards the main hall, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She reached the hall just as Nicolo entered, his bodyguards flanking him. He stopped when he saw her, his blue eyes sweeping over her, assessing. "Valeria," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I trust you have been comfortable." "As comfortable as a prisoner can be," Valeria replied, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You are not a prisoner, Kara.
You are my guest.
A guest who is not allowed to leave, Valeria countered, her voice tinged with bitterness. Nicolo's smile faded. You are here for your own protection, Valeria. Your brother's actions have made you a target. A target for whom? Valeria asked, her voice challenging. Your enemies? Or yours? Nicolo's eyes narrowed. My enemies are your enemies, Valeria. We are bound together now. By your brother's debt. And by other things. His gaze lingered on her, and Valeria felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew he was referring to the agreement, to the fact that she was now his possession. But there was something else in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper, more complex connection. I will not be a pawn in your games, Nicolo, Valeria said, her voice firm. I will not be used. Nicolo stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. You misunderstand me, Kara, he whispered, his voice a low, seductive murmur. I do not play games. I make the rules. And you will follow them. And if I refuse? Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. Nicolo's eyes darkened. You will not refuse, he said, his voice a quiet threat. You have no choice. Valeria felt a surge of anger, of defiance. She was tired of being told she had no choice. She was tired of being a pawn, a victim. I always have a choice, Nicolo, she said, her voice low but firm. And I choose to survive. On my own terms. Nicolo studied her for a long moment, his eyes intense and unreadable. Then he smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. Perhaps you are not as naive as I thought, Valeria Marchesi, he said, his voice laced with a hint of admiration. Perhaps you are stronger than you appear. Perhaps, Valeria replied, her voice still trembling, but her spirit bolstered by his unexpected reaction. He turned and walked towards his study, his bodyguards following him. Valeria watched him go, her mind racing. She had challenged him, and he had not reacted with anger, with violence. He had respected her defiance. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It gave her a glimmer of hope, a sense that she could navigate this dangerous world, that she could survive, perhaps even thrive. She spent the next few days observing Nicolo, studying his habits, his interactions with his staff, his business dealings. She learned that he was a man of contradictions, a man who could be both ruthless and charming, both cold and passionate. She witnessed his interactions with his lieutenants, the men who carried out his orders, the men who controlled his vast empire. She saw the fear and respect they held for him, the unwavering loyalty they displayed. She also saw the subtle tensions, the undercurrents of rivalry and ambition that existed within his inner circle. She learned that Nicolo was involved in a complex web of alliances and rivalries, that he was constantly maneuvering, strategizing, fighting to maintain his power and his control. She learned that his world was a dangerous one, a world of violence and betrayal, a world where trust was a rare and precious commodity. She also saw glimpses of the man beneath the mask, the man who had suffered, the man who had loved, the man who was capable of tenderness. She saw it in the way he spoke of his mother, in the way he treated Sophia, the old housekeeper, with respect and affection. She saw it in the way he looked at her, sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. The masks of civility were carefully maintained, both by her and by him. But beneath the surface, a dangerous game was being played. A game of cat and mouse, of predator and prey. A game where the lines between captor and captive were becoming increasingly blurred. And as Valeria continued to observe, to learn, to adapt, she realized that she was no longer just playing to survive. She was playing to understand, to connect,
To win.
and that, she knew, was the most dangerous game of all, because it meant risking her heart, her soul, everything she had ever held dear. But she was no longer afraid. She was intrigued, and she was determined to see where this dangerous path would lead. even if it led to her destruction. Or to something far more unexpected. Something far more profound. The uncertainty was a constant companion, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was exhilarating. And that, she realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. The masks remained, but the cracks were beginning to show. And behind those cracks, a truth was waiting to be revealed. A truth that could change everything. Chapter 7. Echoes of Betrayal and Longing. One evening, Niccolò invited Valeria to join him for dinner in his private dining room, a smaller, more intimate space than the grand formal dining room. The atmosphere was different, softer, with candlelight illuminating the room and a fire crackling in the hearth. It felt less like a command performance and more like a date. Valeria dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress, her emotions a confusing mix of anticipation and apprehension. She was still wary of Niccolò, still aware of his power and his potential for cruelty, but she was also increasingly drawn to him, to his complexity, to his hidden vulnerabilities. Niccolò was already waiting for her when she arrived, standing by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand. He turned as she entered, his eyes sweeping over her, appreciating. "You look beautiful, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. Valeria felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she replied, her voice slightly unsteady. He gestured towards the table, which was set for two. "Please sit." Valeria took her seat, and Niccolò sat opposite her. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable, not like the strained silences of their previous encounters. There was a tension, yes, but it was a different kind of tension, a tension that hummed with unspoken emotions. Servants appeared, silently serving the first course, a delicate risotto with truffles. Valeria picked at her food, her appetite surprisingly diminished. Niccolò ate with his usual quiet efficiency, but his gaze kept returning to her, lingering. "Tell me, Valeria," he said finally, breaking the silence. "What do you think of my home?" Valeria hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It is impressive," she said. "A testament to your family's power." Niccolò smiled, a wry smile. "Power is a fleeting thing, Cara. It can be taken as easily as it is given. And yet, you seem to hold on to it tenaciously," Valeria observed, her voice low. Niccolò's eyes darkened. "I do what I must to protect what is mine. My family. My possessions." His gaze lingered on her, and Valeria felt a shiver run down her spine. She was one of his possessions, she knew, but she was also beginning to feel like something more. "And what about happiness, Niccolò?" Valeria asked, her voice daring. "Does power bring you happiness?" Niccolò's expression shifted, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "Happiness is a luxury I cannot afford, Valeria. My world is not one of gentle pleasures." "But surely there must be something that brings you joy," Valeria persisted, her curiosity overcoming her caution. Niccolò was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. Then he looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound longing. "There was once," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "My mother, she brought me joy. She was the light in my life." Valeria remembered what Sophia and Isabella had told her about Eleanor's murder, about the trauma that had scarred Niccolò. She felt a surge of empathy for him, for the boy who had lost his mother, for the man who had been shaped by that loss. "I am sorry, Niccolò," she said, her voice sincere. "For your loss." Niccolò nodded, his expression grim. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice tight. "But the pain, it never truly fades." "I understand," Valeria said, her voice soft. "Loss, it leaves a mark." She thought of her own loss, of the life she had left behind, of the freedom she had forfeited. It was a different kind of loss, yes, but it was still a loss, and it still ached. Niccolò looked at her, his eyes searching. "You have known loss, too, Valeria," he said, his voice perceptive. "I see it in your eyes." Valeria felt a lump form in her throat. She had tried to hide her pain, her grief, but Niccolò saw through her facade. He saw her vulnerability, her sadness. "I have lost my freedom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My future." Niccolò's gaze softened. "You are not a prisoner here, Valeria," he said, his voice gentle. "You are my guest. And perhaps something more." His words, his tone, sent a shiver of something other than fear through her. It was a shiver of hope, of possibility. "I want to understand you, Nicolo," Valeria said, her voice bold. "I want to see past the mask." Nicolo's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her directness. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled a slow, genuine smile. "Perhaps that is possible," he said, his voice low. "Perhaps we can both see past the masks." The rest of the dinner passed in a different atmosphere, an atmosphere of intimacy, of connection. They talked not about business or power, but about their lives, their hopes, their dreams. Valeria found herself revealing things she had never told anyone, sharing her fears, her vulnerabilities, her longing for a different life. Nicolo, in turn, revealed glimpses of his own inner world, of the burden he carried, of the loneliness he felt, of the yearning for something more. As the evening drew to a close, Valeria felt a profound shift in her relationship with Nicolo. The fear was still there, yes, but it was mingled with something else: respect, empathy, and a growing, undeniable attraction. He walked her to her room, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. They stood at her door, the silence between them charged with unspoken emotions. "Good night, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Good night, Nicolo," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. She thought he was going to kiss her, and her heart leaped in her chest. But he didn't. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and restraint. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing at her door, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The echoes of betrayal and longing hung heavy in the air. But they were not just his echoes. They were hers too. And they were intertwined, tangled together, creating a bond that was both dangerous and irresistible. A bond that was changing everything. And as Valeria closed her door, she knew that she had crossed a line. A line from which there was no turning back. A line that led to she did not know where. But she was no longer afraid to find out. She was ready for whatever came next, even if it destroyed her or saved her. The uncertainty was a constant hum, but it was no longer a deterrent. It was an invitation, and she was ready to accept. Chapter 8. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The following days were marked by a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between Valeria and Nicolo. The formal distance between them began to erode, replaced by a tentative intimacy, a shared understanding that went beyond the constraints of their situation. They spent more time together, often in silence, simply sharing the same space, reading in the library, walking in the gardens, or sitting by the fire in the evenings. The conversations they had were different, too. They spoke less of business and power and more of personal matters, of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Valeria found herself opening up to Nicolo in ways she never thought possible, revealing her vulnerabilities, her insecurities, her longings. Nicolo, in turn, began to share glimpses of his own inner world, of the burden he carried, of the loneliness he felt, of the yearning for something more than the violence and the power that defined his life. He spoke of his mother with a tenderness that touched Valeria's heart, of the void her death had left in his life. He also spoke of his responsibilities, of the weight of the Moretti legacy, of the constant pressure to maintain control, to protect his family, to uphold the ancient codes. He spoke of the betrayals he had faced, of the enemies he had made, of the constant threat of violence that hung over his world. Valeria listened, her empathy growing with each conversation. She began to understand the complexities of his life, the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had endured. She saw past the mask of the ruthless capo, to the man beneath, the man who was capable of both great cruelty and great tenderness. One afternoon, they were walking in the secret garden, the one Valeria had discovered behind the library. It was a place of quiet beauty, filled with fragrant flowers and ancient olive trees, a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the outside world. They sat on a stone bench, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. Valeria plucked a rose, its petals soft and velvety, its scent intoxicating. "It's beautiful here," she said, her voice low. "A world away from everything." Nicolo nodded, his gaze fixed on the rose in her hand. "Beauty can be found even in the darkest of places, Valeria," he said. "It is a matter of perspective." "And what is your perspective, Nicolo?" Valeria asked, her voice curious. "Do you see beauty in your world?" Nicolo's expression shifted, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "My world is one of necessity," he said. "Of duty. Beauty is a luxury I cannot always afford." "But surely there must be moments," Valeria persisted. "Moments of peace."
Of joy.
Nicolo looked at her, his eyes searching. "There are moments," he admitted, his voice low.
Fleeting moments.
"But they are rare." "And what about love, Nicolo?" Valeria asked, her voice daring. "Have you ever known love?" Nicolo's gaze dropped, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the olive trees. "I loved my mother," he said finally, his voice tight. "With all my heart." "And since then?" Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nicolo looked up at her, his eyes filled with a profound longing, a longing that mirrored her own. He didn't answer, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Valeria felt a surge of something. Empathy, yes, but also something more. A connection, a bond, a shared understanding that went beyond words. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and strong, a tangible reminder of his power, but also of his vulnerability. He didn't pull away. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching, questioning. "I see you, Nicolo," Valeria said, her voice soft. "I see the man beneath the mask." Nicolo's grip tightened on her hand. "And what do you see, Valeria?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "I see sadness," Valeria said.
And strength.
"And loneliness. And a longing for something more." Nicolo's eyes darkened. "And do you see any hope, Valeria?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Valeria met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, that she was risking everything, but she couldn't stop herself. "I see possibility," she said, her voice firm. "The possibility of change. Of healing. Of something more." The air crackles. She feels it. He must feel it too. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. She thought he was going to kiss her, and her breath caught in her throat. But he didn't. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and restraint. He squeezed her hand, then let it drop. "It is getting late," he said, his voice sounding strained. "Yes," she replied, equally as affected, her hand still tingling from his touch. They walked back to the palazzo in silence, the unspoken words, the unfulfilled desires, hanging heavy between them. The weight of those unspoken words was a tangible thing, a force that both connected them and separated them. And as Valeria lay in her bed that night, she knew that the game had changed. The lines had blurred. The stakes had risen. And she was no longer sure who was playing whom, or who was winning, or who would lose. Everything. The uncertainty was a constant hum, but it was no longer a source of fear. It was a source of excitement, of anticipation, of hope. A dangerous, fragile hope, but a hope nonetheless. And that, she realized, was the most powerful force of all. The unspoken words remained, but they were no longer silent. They were screaming, and they were about to be heard, one way or another. Chapter 9. A dance on the edge of danger. The unspoken tension between Valeria and Nicolo thickened in the days that followed, a palpable energy that hummed in the air whenever they were near. They continued their shared routines, the reading in the library, the walks in the garden, the quiet evenings by the fire, But now those moments were charged with a new intensity, a silent acknowledgement of the growing connection between them. One evening, Nicolo found Valeria in the music room, playing the grand piano. The music she played was passionate, melancholic, a reflection of her own turbulent emotions. He stood in the doorway, listening, captivated by her skill, by the raw emotion she poured into the music. When she finished, she turned and saw him, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I didn't know you played," Nicolo said, his voice a low murmur. "It is a release," Valeria replied, her voice slightly unsteady. "A way to express what I cannot say." Nicolo walked towards her, his gaze fixed on her. "And what is it you cannot say, Valeria?" he asked, his voice probing. Valeria hesitated, her fingers lingering on the keys. I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's complicated." "Complicated," Nicolo repeated, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "Life is complicated, Cara, especially in our world. And yet you seem to navigate it effortlessly," Valeria observed, her voice low. Nicolo smiled, a wry smile. "It is an illusion, Valeria. A carefully constructed facade. Beneath the surface, there is always chaos." "And what about you, Nicolo?" Valeria asked, her voice daring. "What lies beneath your surface?" Nicolo's expression shifted, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. "Perhaps you should find out," he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "We are playing a dangerous game, Valeria," he whispered. "A game with no rules." "And what are the stakes, Nicolo?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything," he replied, his voice a quiet threat and a promise. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Are you afraid, Valeria?" Valeria met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, yes, but she was also exhilarated. She was drawn to him, to his darkness, to his hidden vulnerabilities, in a way she couldn't explain, couldn't control. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I am not afraid." Nicolo smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "Then let us dance," he said, his voice low. He took her hand and led her out of the music room, into the grand ballroom, a vast, opulent space with soaring ceilings and glittering chandeliers. The room was empty, silent, but it felt alive with anticipation, with the unspoken tension that crackled between them. Nicolo turned on music, a slow, sensual waltz that filled the room. He took her in his arms, his hand resting on the small of her back, his other hand holding hers. They began to dance, their bodies moving together in a slow, graceful rhythm. Valeria felt a strange sense of freedom, of surrender. She was in his arms, in his power, but she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt alive. They danced in silence, their eyes locked, their bodies moving as one. The world outside the ballroom faded away, the only reality the feel of his arms around her, the sound of his breathing, the intensity of his gaze. Valeria felt a growing sense of desire, a desire that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She wanted him, she realized, with a force that shocked her, that overwhelmed her. She wanted to break through his defenses, to reach the man beneath the mask, to connect with him on a deeper level. As they danced, Nicolo's grip tightened on her, his body pressing closer to hers. Valeria felt the heat of his body, the strength of his muscles, the raw power that emanated from him. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her neck. Valeria shivered, her senses heightened, her body responding to his touch in ways she had never experienced before. "You are intoxicating, Valeria," he whispered, his voice a low, husky murmur. "You tempt me." "And you me," Valeria replied, her voice barely a whisper. He lifted his head, his eyes searching hers. "Do you know what you are doing, Valeria?" he asked, his voice a quiet challenge. I think so, Valeria replied, her voice trembling slightly. This is dangerous, he said, his voice warning. We are playing with fire. I know, Valeria said, her voice firm. But I cannot stop. Nico Lowe's eyes darkened. He pulled her closer, his body molding against hers. He lowered his head, his lips claiming hers in a kiss that was both demanding and tender. Valeria responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of all the unspoken desires, all the unfulfilled longings that had been building between them. The world spun around them, the music fading into the background, the only reality the feel of his lips on hers, the taste of his mouth, the heat of his body. Valeria felt as if she were drowning in a sea of sensation, of emotion, of desire. She had never felt anything like this before, this overwhelming, all-consuming passion. The kiss went on and on and on. A promise, a threat, everything and nothing, all at once. And when they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. The dance had ended, but the game had just begun. A game with no rules, no limits, no guarantees. A game that could lead to their salvation or their destruction. And neither of them knew which it would be. But they were both willing to risk it. To find out. Because the pull between them was too strong, too powerful, to resist. It was a force of nature. And it was about to be unleashed. The ballroom was silent again, except for their ragged breaths. The edge of danger was sharp and close. And they were both standing right on it. Together. Chapter 10. Cracks in the armor of ice. The kiss shattered the fragile equilibrium they had established, leaving in its wake a raw, exposed vulnerability. The following days were a confusing dance of avoidance and intense connection. Nico Lowe became more withdrawn, his mask of control firmly back in place, but Valeria could see the cracks in his armor, the flicker of desire and uncertainty in his eyes whenever their gazes met. She, too, was struggling to reconcile her feelings. The fear was still there, the awareness of his power and the danger he represented, but it was overshadowed by a growing desire, a longing to understand him, to connect with him on a deeper level. She had tasted his passion, his vulnerability, and she couldn't forget it. She wanted more. One evening, she found him in his study, poring over documents, his face etched with worry. The room was dimly lit, the only light source a single lamp on his desk, casting long shadows across the room. Nico Lowe? She said softly, her voice hesitant. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her. He quickly composed himself, his mask of control slipping back into place. Valeria, he said, his voice neutral. What is it? I wanted to talk to you, she said, her voice low. He gestured towards a chair opposite his desk.
Seat.
Valeria sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. About the other night, Valeria began, her voice trembling slightly. The kiss. Nico Lowe's expression hardened. It was a mistake, he said, his voice cold. It should not have happened. Valeria felt a pang of disappointment, of hurt. She had hoped she didn't know what she had hoped, but it wasn't this cold dismissal.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why was it a mistake? Nico Lowe rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders tense, his fists clenched. Because it complicates things, he said finally, his voice low and strained. Because it weakens me. Weakens you? Valeria repeated, her voice incredulous. How can affection weaken you? Nico Lowe turned and looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that made Valeria's breath catch in her throat. Affection is a liability, Valeria, he said, his voice bitter. In my world, it is a weakness. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you susceptible to betrayal. Valeria remembered what Sophia and Isabella had told her about his mother's murder, about the trauma that had shaped him. She understood, now, his fear of vulnerability, his need to protect himself, to keep everyone at a distance. But surely not everyone betrays, Valeria said, her voice soft. Not everyone is cruel. Nicolo's gaze softened slightly. You are naive, Valeria, he said, his voice a low murmur. You see the good in people. You hope for the best. But in my world, hope is a dangerous thing. But without hope, what is there? Valeria asked, her voice pleading. Without love, what is the point? Nicolo stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. There is power, he said, his voice a quiet whisper. There is control. There is survival. And is that enough, Nicolo? Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. Is that truly enough? Nicolo's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. The conflict within him was palpable, the battle between his fear and his desire. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. You challenge me, Valeria, he said, his voice a low murmur. You make me question everything. And is that such a bad thing? Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nicolo's eyes darkened. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. It is dangerous, he whispered. For both of us. He pulled back slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. I cannot promise you anything, Valeria, he said, his voice strained. I cannot offer you a future. I am not asking for promises, Nicolo, Valeria said, her voice firm. I am asking for honesty. For connection. For a chance. Nicolo studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed, a deep, heavy sigh that seemed to release some of the tension that had been building within him. You are a remarkable woman, Valeria Marchesi, he said, his voice laced with a hint of admiration. You see through the cracks in my armor. You see the man beneath the mask. And what do you see, Nicolo? Valeria asked, her voice soft. When you look at me. Nicolo's gaze softened. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. I see beauty, he said, his voice a low murmur.
And strength.
And a light that refuses to be extinguished. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was different from the passionate, desperate kiss of the other night. This kiss was gentle, hesitant, a tentative exploration of a new, fragile connection. Valeria responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, but it was still different. It was a kiss of hope, of possibility, of a future that was still uncertain, but no longer impossible. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. The cracks in the armor of ice were widening, and the light was beginning to shine through. A dangerous, fragile light, but a light nonetheless. And it was changing everything. The study was silent, except for their ragged breaths. The future remained unknown. But for the first time, Valeria felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that was both terrifying and exhilarating. A hope that she was determined to hold on to. No matter what. The ice was melting. Slowly but surely. And what lay beneath was about to be revealed. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom and Loyalty. The tentative intimacy that had blossomed between Valeria and Nicolo was tested by the harsh realities of his world. News arrived of a growing conflict with a rival family, the Baroness, who were challenging the Moretti's control over a lucrative smuggling route. Nicolo became preoccupied, his days filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and tense phone calls. He was often absent from the palazzo, and when he was present, he was distant, his mind elsewhere. Valeria understood the pressure he was under, the weight of the responsibilities he carried, but she also felt a growing sense of isolation, of being shut out from his world. She missed their conversations, their shared moments of connection, the fragile bond that had begun to form between them. One evening, she found him in the courtyard, standing by the fountain, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his expression grim. Nicolo? She said softly, approaching him. He turned, startled, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her. He quickly composed himself, his mask of control slipping back into place. Valeria, he said, his voice neutral. What is it? I wanted to see how you were, she said, her voice low. You seem troubled. Nicolo sighed, running a hand through his hair. It is a difficult situation, he said, his voice strained. The Baroness are ambitious. They are pushing for a war. And what will you do? Valeria asked, her voice hesitant. Nicolo's expression hardened. I will do what I must to protect my family, my territory, my interests. And what about the cost? Valeria asked, her voice challenging. The cost in lives? In blood? Nicolo's eyes narrowed. There is always a cost, Valeria. In our world, there is no such thing as a free victory. But surely there must be another way, Valeria persisted. A way to negotiate. To compromise. Nicolo shook his head. Compromise is seen as weakness, Valeria. In our world, weakness is fatal. But is violence the only answer? Valeria asked, her voice pleading. Is there no room for diplomacy? For peace? Nicolo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. You are idealistic, Valeria, he said, his voice a low murmur. You see the world through different eyes. But in my world, peace is a fragile thing, easily broken. But shouldn't we strive for it? Valeria asked, her voice firm. Shouldn't we try to find a better way? Nicolo stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. I admire your idealism, Valeria, he said, his voice a quiet whisper. But it is misplaced. In our world, the only way to survive is to be strong, to be ruthless, to be feared. And is that what you want, Nicolo? Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. To be feared? To be alone? Nicolo's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. The conflict within him was palpable, the battle between his ingrained beliefs and his growing feelings for her. He reached out and caressed her face. Sometimes he started, his voice rough, I do not know what I want. He turned abruptly and walked away, leaving her alone in the courtyard, her heart aching. She understood his world, his pressures, his fears. But she also believed in the possibility of something more, of something better. She knew that changing him, changing his world, would be a monumental task, perhaps an impossible one. But she couldn't give up. She couldn't abandon the hope that had begun to blossom within her, the hope that he, too, could find a different path. The next few days were filled with a growing tension, both within the palazzo and in the world outside. Valeria heard rumors of escalating violence, of skirmishes between the Moretti and Barone families, of threats and counter-threats. She tried to talk to Nicolo, to reason with him, to urge him to find a peaceful solution, but he was increasingly distant, his mind consumed by the looming conflict. He was like a tightly wound spring, ready to snap at any moment. One evening, he returned to the palazzo late, his clothes stained with blood, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury that made Valeria's blood run cold. Nicolo, she exclaimed, rushing to him. What happened? He pushed her away, his hands rough. Do not touch me, he said, his voice harsh. I am not fit to be touched. Valeria recoiled, hurt and fear mixing within her. She had never seen him like this before, so brutal, so consumed by violence. What happened? She asked again, her voice trembling. Nicolo turned away from her, his shoulders heaving. There was a confrontation, he said, his voice strained. With the Baroness. Men died. Valeria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had known, intellectually, that his world was one of violence, but seeing the reality of it, the blood on his clothes, the fury in his eyes, was sickening. I am sorry, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Nicolo turned back to her, his eyes filled with a pain that made Valeria's heart ache. This is my world, Valeria, he said, his voice raw. This is what I do. This is who I am. But it doesn't have to be, Valeria said, her voice pleading. You can choose a different path. You can change. Nico Lo shook his head, his expression hopeless. It is too late, Valeria. I am too far gone. I am trapped. No, Valeria said, her voice firm. It is never too late. You are not trapped, Niccolo. You have a choice. You can choose freedom. Freedom? Niccolo repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. There is no freedom in my world, Valeria. Only duty. Only loyalty. Only survival. He stared at her, the conflict evident. The price of freedom and loyalty was steep. And he was paying it. Every single day. And she was paying it with him, whether she knew it or not. The weight of that realization settled on Valeria's shoulders, heavy and suffocating. The night was dark, and the shadows were long. And the future uncertain. More uncertain than ever before. The violence had escalated. And the consequences were about to be felt. By everyone. Chapter 12. Beneath the surface of control. The aftermath of the confrontation with the Baroness hung heavy over the palazzo. Niccolo became even more withdrawn, his presence a brooding shadow that seemed to darken every corner of the house. He spent most of his time locked in his study, surrounded by his lieutenants, planning his next move. Valeria saw him only fleetingly, his face grim, his eyes haunted by the violence he had both witnessed and inflicted. She tried to reach him, to break through his defenses, but he remained distant, his emotions locked down behind a wall of control. She understood his need to protect himself, to project an image of strength, but she also ached for the man she knew was buried beneath the surface, the man who was capable of tenderness, of vulnerability, of love. One afternoon, she found him in the library, standing by the window, staring out at the sea. He didn't seem to notice her enter, his mind clearly elsewhere. Niccolo? She said softly, approaching him. He turned, startled, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her. He quickly composed himself, his mask of control slipping back into place, but Valeria could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain etched on his face. Valeria, he said, his voice neutral. What is it? I wanted to talk to you, she said, her voice low. About what happened. Niccolo sighed, running a hand through his hair. There is nothing to talk about, Valeria. It is over. But the men who died, Valeria persisted. The violence. It cannot be over. Niccolo's expression hardened. It is the way of our world, Valeria. You must accept that. I cannot accept it, Valeria said, her voice firm. I cannot accept that violence is the only answer. That death is the only solution. Niccolo turned away from her, his shoulders tense. You are naive, Valeria, he said, his voice low. You do not understand. Then help me understand, Valeria pleaded. Help me see your world through your eyes. Niccolo was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the sea. Then, he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a pain that made Valeria's heart ache. My world is one of shadows, Valeria, he said, his voice raw. Of betrayal. Of constant threat. There is no room for weakness. For sentimentality. For love. But surely there must be something more, Valeria said, her voice soft. Something that makes it all worthwhile. Niccolo's gaze softened slightly. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. There is loyalty, he said, his voice a quiet whisper. There is family. There is the protection of what is mine. His gaze lingered on her, and Valeria felt a shiver run down her spine. She was his, she knew, a part of his world, a part of his possessions. But she was also beginning to feel like something more. And what about me, Niccolo? Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. What am I to you? Niccolo's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. The conflict within him was palpable, the battle between his ingrained beliefs and his growing feelings for her. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. You are a complication, Valeria, he said, his voice a low murmur. A distraction. A temptation. And are you tempted, Nicolo? Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nicolo's eyes darkened. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. More than you know, he whispered. He pulled back slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. But I cannot allow myself to be weak, he said, his voice strained. I cannot afford to care. But you do care, Nicolo, Valeria said, her voice firm. I see it in your eyes. I feel it in your touch. You care about me. Nicolo's expression crumbled slightly, his mask of control slipping. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. I do not know what I feel, Valeria, he said, his voice raw. I only know that you unsettle me. You make me question everything I have ever believed. And is that such a bad thing? Valeria asked, her voice soft. Nicolo didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a sadness that mirrored her own. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the library, her heart aching. She understood his struggle, his fear of vulnerability, his need to maintain control. But she also knew that beneath the surface of that control, there was a man capable of great love, of great compassion. And she was determined to reach that man, to break through his defenses, to show him that there was another way, a way of peace, of love, of freedom, even if it meant risking everything, even if it meant facing his darkness head-on. The surface of control was cracking, and what lay beneath was about to be revealed, in all its raw, vulnerable, terrifying beauty. And Valeria was ready to face it, with him, or without him. The library was silent, the books lining the walls like silent witnesses. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The game had changed. Again. And the stakes were higher than ever. Life.
Death. Love. Loss.
Everything was on the line. And the battle had just begun. A battle for his soul. And perhaps for hers, too. The silence was deafening. But beneath the silence a storm was brewing. A storm that would change everything. Chapter 13. A glimmer of unexpected hope. The tension within the palazzo reached a breaking point. Nicolo received word that the Baroness were planning a major attack, a move that would undoubtedly escalate the conflict into a full-blown war. He became even more withdrawn, his focus solely on preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He was like a caged lion, pacing restlessly, his anger and frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Valeria watched him, her heart aching for him, for the burden he carried, for the violence that consumed his life. She knew she had to do something, anything, to try to prevent the bloodshed, to try to reach the man she knew was buried beneath the layers of control and fear. One evening, she found him in his study, poring over maps and strategic plans, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the desk lamp. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched. "Nicolo," she said softly, approaching him. He didn't look up, his focus remaining on the documents before him. "Leave me, Valeria," he said, his voice harsh. "I have work to do." "I know," Valeria said, her voice firm. "But we need to talk." Nicolo finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and weariness. "There is nothing to talk about, Valeria. The situation is what it is." "But it doesn't have to be this way," Valeria persisted. "There must be another way. A way to avoid the war." Nicolo slammed his fist on the desk, making Valeria jump. "There is no other way," he exclaimed, his voice raw. "The Baroness will not stop until they have destroyed us. Until they have taken everything." "But what if you could negotiate?" Valeria suggested. "What if you could offer them something in exchange for peace?" Nicolo shook his head, his expression hopeless. "They do not want peace, Valeria. They want power. They want control. They want what is mine." "But surely there must be something they want more," Valeria said, her voice pleading. "Something you could offer them that would be worth more than bloodshed." Nicolo was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the maps before him. Then he looked up at her, his eyes searching. There is one thing, he said finally, his voice low. One thing they have always coveted.
What?
Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Access, Nicolo said, his voice strained. Access to the eastern coast. To the Marquesi territory. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. She understood, now, the implications of his words. The Baroness wanted access to her family's territory, to the smuggling routes that were controlled by the Marqueses. But my father, he would never agree, Valeria said, her voice trembling. No, Nicolo said, his voice grim. He would not. Unless what? Valeria asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Nicolo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and hope. Unless I could offer him something in return, he said, his voice low. Something that would guarantee his cooperation. Something that would protect his family. And what is that, Nicolo? Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nicolo hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Then he spoke, his words shocking Valeria to her core. An alliance, he said, his voice firm. A marriage alliance. Between the Moretis and the Marqueses. Valeria stared at him, her mind reeling. A marriage alliance? Between him and her? It was unthinkable. And yet it made a strange kind of sense. It would unite the two families, combine their power, and end the conflict with the Baroness. But my father, he would never agree to me marrying you, Valeria said, her voice trembling.
He sees you as the enemy. Nicolo smiled, a wry smile.
Perhaps, he said, his voice low. But he also sees me as a powerful ally. And he is a pragmatic man. He will do what is best for his family. For his legacy. Valeria knew he was right. Her father would consider the alliance, weigh the pros and cons, and ultimately make a decision based on what was best for the Marqueses. And what about you, Nicolo? Valeria asked, her voice soft.
What do you want?
Nicolo's gaze softened. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. I want peace, Valeria, he said, his voice a low murmur. I want an end to the violence. I want a future. And, do you see me in that future? Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nicolo's eyes darkened. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. I see you everywhere, he whispered. He pulled back slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. This is not a love match, Valeria, he said, his voice firm. It is a strategic alliance. A business arrangement. I understand, Valeria said, her voice steady, even though her heart was aching. But it could be more, Nicolo said, his voice hesitant.
It could be a partnership.
A bond. A beginning. Valeria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. A glimmer of unexpected hope had appeared. A hope for peace. A hope for a future. A hope for something more. But it was a fragile hope, a hope that could easily be shattered. The decision rested with her father. And with Nicolo. And with her.
She had a choice to make.
A choice that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of two families. And the fate of a potential love. A love that was born in darkness, in violence, in captivity. But a love that was real. And growing stronger. Every day, the glimmer of hope was small. But it was there.
And it was enough. For now. To keep her going.
To keep her fighting. For a future that was still uncertain. But no longer impossible. She looked into his eyes and, for the first time, didn't see the capo.
She saw a man.
A man she could, perhaps, come to love. And that changed everything. Chapter 14. The unraveling of family secrets. The proposal of a marriage alliance hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope amidst the looming threat of war. Nicolo, despite his outward calm, was a whirlwind of activity, making calls, sending messages, and preparing for a meeting with Valeria's father, Don Alessandro Marquesi. He knew that convincing Alessandro would be a formidable task, a delicate dance of diplomacy and veiled threats. Valeria, meanwhile, was grappling with the enormity of the proposition. A marriage to Nicolo. It was a terrifying prospect, yet also strangely alluring. She had seen beneath his mask of control, glimpsed the vulnerable man beneath, and she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt for him. But marriage? It was a commitment she had never envisioned, a life she had never imagined. She spent hours wandering the palazzo, her mind racing, her emotions a turbulent mix of fear, excitement, and uncertainty. She found herself drawn to the small, secret garden, the place where she had first begun to understand Niccolò, to see him as more than just her captor. One afternoon, as she sat on the stone bench, lost in thought, she heard a familiar voice. "Valeria?" She turned and saw Isabella, her aunt, standing at the entrance to the garden. Isabella had arrived at the palazzo earlier that day, summoned by Niccolò to act as a mediator, a go-between between him and Alessandro. "Zia," Valeria said, rising from the bench. "What are you doing here?"
Isabella smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
"Niccolò has informed me of his proposal," she said. "He asked me to speak with you." Valeria's heart pounded in her chest. "And what do you think?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Isabella stepped closer, her gaze searching Valeria's face.
"I think it is a bold move," she said.
"A risky one. But it could also be a brilliant one." "Brilliant?" Valeria repeated, her voice incredulous. "How can marrying a man like Niccolò Moretti be considered brilliant?" Isabella sighed. "Because it would unite our families, Valeria. It would end the conflict with the Baroness. It would secure our future." "But at what cost?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling. "My freedom? My happiness?" Isabella reached out and took Valeria's hand, her grip surprisingly gentle. "Your freedom was already forfeit, Valeria. You were a pawn in a game. This gives you agency. This gives you power." "Power?" Valeria repeated, her voice bitter. "What power does a wife have in a world like this?" "More than you think," Isabella said, her voice firm. "You are intelligent, Valeria. And you are strong. You have influence.
You can shape events.
You can make a difference." Valeria looked at her aunt, her eyes filled with doubt. "But I don't love him, Zia," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
Isabella smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
"Love is a luxury, Valeria. In our world, it is often a liability.
But it can also grow.
It can develop. It can surprise you." Valeria was silent for a long moment, her thoughts swirling. She thought of Niccolò, of his darkness, his violence, but also of his tenderness, his vulnerability, his longing for something more. He cares for me, Zia," Valeria said, her voice hesitant. I see it in his eyes. I feel it in his touch." Isabella nodded. "He does," she said. "He is drawn to you, Valeria. To your strength. To your light. You challenge him. You make him question. But is that enough?" Valeria asked, her voice pleading. "Is that enough to build a marriage on?" Isabella squeezed Valeria's hand. "It is a start, Valeria. A foundation. And it is more than many marriages in our world have." Isabella released Valeria's hand and walked towards the edge of the garden, looking out at the sea. "Your father, he is considering the proposal," she said, her voice low. "He is weighing the options. He is a pragmatic man.
He will do what is best for the family."
"But what about what I want?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling. Isabella turned back to her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "Your father, he has always protected you, Valeria," she said. "He has shielded you from the harsher realities of our world. But he also underestimated you. He did not see your strength, your resilience." "And you did?" Valeria asked, her voice soft.
Isabella smiled, a sad smile.
"I saw something in you, Valeria. Something different. Something special. A fire that refused to be extinguished." She paused, then continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are secrets, Valeria. Family secrets. Things you do not know." Valeria's heart pounded in her chest. "What secrets?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Your mother, she was not who you think she was," she said, her voice low. Valeria stared at her, her mind reeling. What do you mean?" Isabella stepped closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Your mother, she was not just a demure Don's wife.
She was involved."
in the family business. She was a powerful woman. In her own way. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. This was shocking. She had always believed her mother to be a gentle, submissive woman, a woman who had lived in her father's shadow.
But how?
Valeria asked, her voice trembling. How is that possible? Isabella smiled, a knowing smile. There are ways, Valeria. Subtle ways. Ways that men do not always see. Your mother, she had influence. She had connections. She had secrets. And my father, he knew? Valeria asked, her voice incredulous. Isabella nodded.
He knew, she said.
And he respected her for it. He relied on her. He loved her. Isabella took a step closer. And your brother, Marco. She began, her voice laced with a venom Valeria rarely heard. He knew nothing. He knows nothing. He is weak and foolish, and he would have destroyed everything. Valeria's mind was spinning. Her entire understanding of her family, of her mother, of her own life, was being shattered. The unraveling of family secrets was a painful, disorienting process. Why are you telling me this now? Valeria asked, her voice trembling. Isabella looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and hope. Because you are like her, Valeria, she said. You have her strength, her intelligence, her fire, and you need to know who you truly are. You need to know your legacy. The weight of her aunt's words settled on Valeria's shoulders, heavy and empowering. She was not just a pawn, a bargaining chip. She was a Marchese, a woman with a hidden strength, a hidden legacy. And she was about to step into a role she had never imagined, a role that would require all her courage, all her intelligence, and all her fire. The family's secrets were unraveling, and with them, a new understanding of herself and her future was emerging, a future that was still uncertain, but no longer terrifying. It was challenging and exhilarating, and she was ready to face it, to embrace it, to own it. The garden was silent, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the olive trees. But within Valeria, a storm was brewing, a storm of revelation, of transformation, of power, and it was about to be unleashed on the world and on Niccolò. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 15. The storm breaks within and without. The meeting between Don Alessandro Marchesi and Niccolò Moretti was held in the grand salon of the Palazzo, a room steeped in history and power. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air crackling with unspoken threats and veiled negotiations. Valeria was not present at the meeting, but she felt its weight, its significance, in every fiber of her being. She paced restlessly in her room, her mind racing, her emotions a turbulent mix of fear and anticipation. She knew that her father was a shrewd negotiator, a man who would not easily be swayed. But she also knew that Niccolò was equally determined, equally ruthless, and that he would not back down. Hours passed, and the silence from the salon was deafening. Valeria could hear the faint murmur of voices, but she couldn't make out the words, couldn't discern the tone of the conversation. She imagined the two men facing each other, locked in a battle of wills, their words weapons, their silences loaded with meaning. Finally, the doors to the salon opened, and Niccolò emerged, his face unreadable. He saw Valeria waiting in the hallway, her expression anxious, her body tense. "Valeria," he said, his voice neutral. "Come with me." He led her to his study, the room where so much of their shared history had unfolded. He closed the door behind them, plunging them into a dim, intimate space. Valeria looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did he agree?" Niccolò hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. "He agreed," he said, his voice low. "To the alliance. To the marriage." Valeria felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of something else. Excitement? Apprehension? She wasn't sure. "But there were conditions," Niccolò continued, his voice strained. "He demands concessions." "Well, what kind of concessions?" Valeria asked, her voice hesitant. Niccolò sighed, running a hand through his hair.
He wants assurances, he said.
Assurances of your safety,
Of your well-being.
of your position within the Moretti family. And did you give him those assurances? Valeria asked, her voice soft. Niccolò looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and tenderness. I did, he said, his voice firm. I promised him that you would be protected, that you would be respected, that you would be my wife in every sense of the word. Valeria felt her cheeks flush. His words, his tone, sent a shiver down her spine. He was promising her more than just a marriage of convenience, more than just a strategic alliance. He was promising her a partnership, a bond, a future. And what about the Baroness? Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. Niccolò's expression hardened. The alliance changes everything, he said. It strengthens our position. It makes us invulnerable. So there will be no war? Valeria asked, her voice hopeful. Niccolò hesitated. There will be challenges, he said. There will be resistance. But we will prevail. Together. His gaze lingered on her, and Valeria felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. It was more than just relief, more than just gratitude. It was a connection, a bond, a shared understanding that went beyond words. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. This is not how I imagined my wedding, he said, his voice a low murmur. But it is a beginning. A beginning, Valeria repeated, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. He bent down and kissed her. It was not the tentative, questioning kiss they had shared before. It was a kiss of possession, of claiming, of promise. Valeria responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of all the unspoken desires, all the unfulfilled longings that had been building between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. The storm had broken, both within and without. The meeting with her father, the looming conflict with the Baroness, the unraveling of family secrets, all had converged, creating a tempest of emotions and events. But amidst the storm, there was a calm center, a connection, a bond, a love that was beginning to blossom, tentatively, fragilely, but undeniably. The future was still uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers. But they would face it together, as husband and wife, as partners, as lovers. The salon was silent, but the echoes of the agreement, of the alliance, of the marriage, reverberated throughout the palazzo, and throughout their lives. The storm raged on, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that, they both knew, was everything. The world outside was in chaos. But within the walls of the palazzo, within the walls of their hearts, a new world was being born. A world of hope, of possibility, of love. A dangerous, fragile love, but a love nonetheless. And it was about to change everything. For both of them. Forever. The storm was a metaphor and a reality. And they were in the eye of it. Together. Chapter 16. A choice between two worlds. The announcement of the impending marriage between Valeria Marchesi and Niccolò Moretti sent shockwaves through both families and through the wider world of the Sicilian mafia. It was a union that few had anticipated, a merging of two powerful dynasties that had long been rivals. The alliance promised to reshape the landscape of power, to create a formidable force that would be virtually untouchable. But for Valeria, it was more than just a political maneuver, more than just a strategic alliance. It was a choice, a conscious decision to embrace a life she had never imagined, a life filled with danger, with uncertainty, but also with a growing love for a man who was both her captor and her protector. Preparations for the wedding began immediately, transforming the palazzo into a whirlwind of activity. Designers, caterers, florists, and musicians descended upon the house, transforming it into a lavish spectacle. Valeria was swept up in the preparations, but she also felt a sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play unfold, a play in which she was the reluctant star. She had chosen this path, yes, but she was still grappling with the enormity of her decision, with the implications of marrying Niccolò, of becoming a part of his world. She was torn between two worlds, the world of her upbringing, of privilege and protection, and the world of the mafia, of violence and power. Niccolò, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of activity, overseeing the wedding preparations while also managing the ongoing tensions with the Baroness. He was attentive to Valeria, ensuring that she had everything she needed, that she was comfortable, that she was protected. But he also remained somewhat distant, his emotions carefully guarded, his focus divided between his responsibilities and his growing feelings for her. One evening, Valeria found him in the gardens, standing by the fountain, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked different somehow. Less guarded, more vulnerable. "Niccolò?" she said softly, approaching him. He turned, startled, his eyes widening slightly when he saw her. He quickly composed himself, but Valeria could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Something that looked like relief. "Valeria," he said, his voice neutral. "What is it?" "I wanted to talk to you," she said, her voice low. "About the wedding." Niccolò sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It is a necessary spectacle, Valeria. A show of force. A demonstration of our unity. But is it what you want?" Valeria asked, her voice hesitant. "This elaborate ceremony?" Niccolò's expression softened slightly. "It is not about what I want, Valeria," he said. "It is about what is expected. What is required." "But what about us?" Valeria asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What about our feelings?" Niccolò stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. "Our feelings are a complication, Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. "A distraction. A weakness. But they are also real," Valeria said, her voice firm. "And they cannot be ignored." Niccolò's eyes darkened. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. "I know," he said, his voice a quiet whisper. "And that terrifies me." He pulled back slightly, his eyes still locked on hers. "This marriage, it is a risk, Valeria," he said, his voice strained. "For both of us." "I know," Valeria said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I am willing to take that risk."
"Why?"
Niccolò asked, his voice probing. "Why are you willing to marry me? A man like me?" Valeria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "Because I see you, Niccolò," she said, her voice soft. "I see the man beneath the mask. I see your strength, your vulnerability, your longing for something more." Niccolò's expression crumbled slightly, his mask of control slipping. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "You see me?" he asked, his voice raw. "I do," Valeria said, her voice firm. "And I am beginning to love you." Niccolò's breath caught in his throat. He stared at her, his eyes wide, his expression stunned. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Valeria," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I do not know what to say." "Say that you feel it too," Valeria pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. Niccolò's eyes darkened. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with emotion. It was a kiss of acceptance, of surrender, of love. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. The choice had been made. Between two worlds, between two lives, between fear and love. And love had won. Tentatively, fragilely, but undeniably. The wedding preparations continued, but now there was a new energy, a new hope. A hope for a future together. A future that was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but a future that was now filled with love. A dangerous, fragile love, but a love nonetheless. And it was about to change everything. Valeria knew her choice, and, for the first time, felt at peace. The two worlds were merging, and she was at the center. The calm before the storm, some would say. But to her, it felt like the beginning of forever. However long or short that might be, she had made her choice, and she would not look back. Chapter 17. The Scars That Bind and Divide. The wedding day arrived, a spectacle of Sicilian grandeur and mafia power. The palazzo was transformed, overflowing with flowers, music, and guests from across the island and beyond. Valeria, dressed in a breathtaking gown of ivory silk and lace, felt like a princess in a fairy tale, yet also a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was marrying Niccolò Moretti, the man she had come to love, but she was also marrying into a world of violence and betrayal, a world she was still struggling to understand. The ceremony was held in the palazzo's grand ballroom, beneath the glittering chandeliers, before a crowd of hundreds. Valeria walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Niccolò waiting for her at the altar, his face a mask of controlled emotion, his eyes dark and intense. As she reached him, he took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. The ceremony proceeded, the ancient words of the Catholic rite echoing through the ballroom. Valeria felt a sense of unreality, as if she were watching the scene from afar, detached from the proceedings. But when she looked into Niccolò's eyes, she saw a flicker of something that grounded her, that brought her back to the present moment. It was a look of tenderness, of vulnerability, of love. And in that moment, she knew that she had made the right choice. They exchanged vows, their voices clear and strong, their words binding them together in a union that was both a strategic alliance and a promise of something more. The rings were exchanged, the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and the crowd erupted in applause. Niccolò leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deliberate kiss that was both a public display of affection and a private promise of intimacy. Valeria responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, a reflection of the love that had blossomed between them, a love that had defied the odds, that had overcome the darkness. The reception that followed was a lavish affair, a celebration of power and wealth, of family and tradition. Valeria and Niccolò moved through the crowd, greeting guests, accepting congratulations, playing their roles as the newlywed couple, the heads of a united mafia empire. But beneath the surface of celebration, there were tensions, undercurrents of rivalry and resentment. Valeria noticed the whispers, the glances, the subtle jabs from some of the guests, particularly from the women who had once hoped to capture Niccolò's attention, to secure his power for themselves. She also noticed the presence of Marco, her brother, the man whose actions had led to her being offered to Niccolò as payment for a debt. He was sullen and resentful, his eyes filled with a mixture of jealousy and shame. Valeria felt a pang of pity for him, but also a sense of detachment. He had made his choices, and she had made hers. As the evening wore on, Valeria began to feel the weight of her new role, the responsibilities that came with being Niccolò's wife, with being a part of the Moretti family. She was no longer just Valeria Marchesi, the sheltered daughter of a don. She was Valeria Moretti, the wife of a capo, a woman of power, a woman who would be expected to play her part in the intricate game of mafia politics. She also felt the weight of the past, of the scars that both she and Niccolò carried, the scars of loss, of betrayal, of violence. She knew that those scars would bind them together, but they could also divide them. Niccolò, too, was feeling the strain. He was constantly surrounded by his lieutenants, discussing business, strategizing, dealing with the ongoing threat from the Baroness. He was attentive to Valeria, but she could see the tension in his eyes, the weariness in his voice. Late in the evening, Valeria found herself alone on the balcony, overlooking the sea. The night air was cool and refreshing, a welcome respite from the heat and noise of the reception. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts, to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that were swirling within her. She heard a footstep behind her and turned to see Nicolo approaching. He looked tired, his face etched with worry, but also softer, somehow. "Valeria," he said, his voice low. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," Valeria replied, her voice honest. "It's a lot to process." Nicolo nodded, his gaze understanding. "It is," he said. "For both of us." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. Valeria leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For keeping your promise. For protecting me." Nicolo's expression softened. "I will always protect you, Valeria," he said, his voice firm. "That is my vow. To you. And to myself." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Valeria rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt safe, somehow, in his embrace. Safe and loved. "This marriage," Nicolo said, his voice a low murmur. "It is more than just an alliance, Valeria. It is a chance. A chance for a new beginning. For both of us." "I know," Valeria said, her voice soft. "And I want that, Nicolo. I want a future with you." Nicolo's grip tightened on her. "We will have that future, Valeria," he said, his voice determined. "We will overcome everything. Together." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises, with unspoken hopes, with unspoken love. The scars that bound them and divided them were still there, but they were fading, slowly but surely. And in their place, a new bond was forming, a bond of love, of trust, of partnership. A bond that would be tested, challenged, but a bond that would, hopefully, endure. The night was dark, but the stars were shining brightly. And for the first time, Valeria felt a sense of peace. A peace that came from knowing that she was not alone, that she had Nicolo by her side, and that together they could face anything. Even the darkness of their world. Even the scars of their past. The wedding was over, but their journey had just begun. A journey into the unknown, but a journey they would take together. Hand in hand. Heart to heart, forever. Or so they hoped. In the silence of the night, a new chapter began. A chapter of love. And of hope. Under the Sicilian sky, the scars remained. But they were no longer defining. They were a part of their story. But not the whole story. The whole story was yet to be written. And they would write it together. Chapter 18. Reckoning with the Past. The weeks following the wedding were a period of adjustment, of learning to navigate their new roles as husband and wife, as partners in a complex and dangerous world. Valeria and Nicolo settled into a routine, a delicate balance between their personal lives and their public responsibilities. They shared meals, spent evenings together, and slowly, tentatively, began to build a life together. But the past, with its shadows and secrets, continued to haunt them. The threat from the Baroness remained, a constant undercurrent of tension that colored their days. And within the Moretti family itself, there were whispers, resentments, and rivalries that threatened to undermine their newfound unity. Valeria, now fully immersed in the world of the Mafia, began to understand the intricacies of its power dynamics, the unspoken rules, the constant threat of violence. She learned to read the subtle cues, to interpret the veiled threats, to navigate the treacherous waters of family politics. She also discovered that she had a strength, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. One evening, Nicolo returned to the palazzo late, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury that Valeria had come to recognize. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Nicolo hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The Baroness," he said, his voice strained. "They attacked one of our shipments. There were casualties." Valeria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had hoped that the alliance with her family would deter the Baroness, that it would bring an end to the violence. But it seemed that the conflict was far from over. What will you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nicolo's expression hardened. "I will retaliate," he said, his voice a quiet threat. "I will make them pay." Valeria understood his need for retribution, his need to protect his family, his territory. But she also feared the cycle of violence, the endless bloodshed that seemed to define their world. "Nicolo," she said, her voice pleading, "there must be another way. A way to end this, without more death." Nicolo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and longing. "There is no other way, Valeria," he said, his voice raw. "This is our world. This is how we survive." "But it doesn't have to be," Valeria insisted. "We can change things. We can create a different future." Nicolo shook his head, his expression hopeless. "You are idealistic, Valeria," he said. "You believe in a world that does not exist." "But we can make it exist," Valeria said, her voice firm. "We can build it. Together." Nicolo stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses. "And what if I am not the man you think I am?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "What if I am too far gone? What if I am incapable of change?" Valeria reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I don't believe that, Nicolo," she said, her voice soft. "I see the good in you. I see the potential. I see the man you could be." Nicolo's eyes darkened. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with emotion. It was a kiss of hope, of possibility, of a future that was still uncertain, but no longer impossible. When they finally broke apart, Nicolo's expression was different, somehow. Softer, more vulnerable. "I will try, Valeria," he said, his voice hesitant. "For you I will try." And in that moment, Valeria knew that they had a chance. A chance to break the cycle of violence, to build a different future, to create a world where love and peace could triumph over darkness and fear. But the path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles. They would have to face their enemies, both external and internal. And they would have to reckon with their own pasts, with the scars that bound them and divided them. One day, Valeria discovered a hidden room in the palazzo, a small, dusty chamber filled with old documents, letters, and photographs. It was a room that seemed to hold the secrets of the Moretti family, the secrets of Nicolo's past. She spent hours in the room, poring over the documents, piecing together the fragments of history. She learned more about Nicolo's mother, Eleanor, about her life, her death, and the impact it had had on him. She also discovered evidence of betrayals, of rivalries, of long-standing feuds that had shaped the Moretti family for generations. And she found a letter written by Nicolo's father, the previous Don Moretti, a letter that revealed a shocking truth. A truth that would change everything. The letter revealed that Nicolo's father had orchestrated Eleanor's murder. He had been jealous of her influence over Nicolo, fearful of her English heritage, and he had arranged for her to be killed, making it look like the work of a rival family. Valeria was stunned, horrified by the revelation. Nicolo had spent his life seeking vengeance for a crime that had been committed by his own father. He had built his entire identity, his entire world on a lie. She knew she had to tell him, but she also feared his reaction. How would he react to the truth? Would it shatter him? Would it destroy the fragile bond that had formed between them? The reckoning with the past was a painful, devastating process. But it was also necessary. For Nicolo, for Valeria, for their future. The hidden room held the secrets. And the secrets were about to be revealed. In all their raw, brutal, transformative power. Valeria held the letter in her trembling hands. The weight of its content was enormous. This knowledge would alter the course of their lives. Forever. And she was the one who had to deliver it. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for the storm to come. A storm that would test their love, their strength, their everything. The past was a ghost. And it was time to face it. Head on. Chapter 19. The Fragile Threads of Trust. Valeria knew she couldn't keep the truth from Nicolo. The secret of his father's betrayal was a festering wound, a poison that would continue to corrupt his life until it was exposed and cleansed. But she also knew that revealing the truth would be like detonating a bomb. shattering the foundations of his world and potentially destroying the fragile trust that had grown between them. She waited until late one evening, when the palazzo was quiet and the weight of the day's events had settled. She found Nico low in his study, as she had so many times before, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of weariness and something else. Something that looked like love. "Valeria," he said, his voice soft. "What is it?" Valeria took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she held out the letter. I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In a hidden room. It's from your father." Nicolo's eyes narrowed. He took the letter, his fingers brushing against hers. He unfolded the brittle paper, his gaze scanning the faded handwriting. As he read, Valeria watched his face, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the initial confusion, then the disbelief, then the dawning horror, and finally, the crushing weight of the truth. He finished reading, his hands trembling, his face ashen. He looked up at Valeria, his eyes filled with a pain so profound, so raw, that it made her breath catch in her throat. This is a lie," he said, his voice hoarse. "It cannot be true." I wish it weren't," Valeria said, her voice trembling. "But I've checked.
I've verified.
It's true, Nicolo. Your father, he orchestrated your mother's murder." Nicolo stared at her, his eyes wide, his expression shattered. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, his entire world collapsing around him. He rose from his chair, his legs unsteady. He walked to the window, his back to Valeria, his shoulders heaving. She could hear his ragged breathing, the sound of his silent sobs. Valeria wanted to go to him, to hold him, to comfort him, but she knew that he needed space, that he needed to process the devastating truth on his own. She stood there, silent, her heart aching for him, for the pain he was enduring, for the betrayal he had suffered. After what seemed like an eternity, Nicolo turned back to her, his face streaked with tears, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage, grief, and disbelief.
"Why?"
he whispered, his voice raw. "Why would he do this?" He was jealous, Nicolo, Valeria said, her voice soft. "Jealous of your mother's influence. Fearful of her heritage." Nicolo shook his head, his expression lost. "My whole life," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My whole life has been a lie." "I know," Valeria said, her voice trembling. "And I am so sorry." Nicolo stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His scent, that intoxicating mix of cologne and something darker, filled her senses, but now it was mixed with a scent of grief, of despair.
"Did you know?"
he asked, his voice probing, his eyes searching hers. "Did you know before you married me?" "No," Valeria said, her voice firm. "I swear I did not know. I only discovered this today." Nicolo studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was searching for any sign of deception, any hint of betrayal. But all he found was honesty and love. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Valeria leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. I believe you," he said, his voice a quiet whisper. Valeria's heart leaped with relief. He believed her. He trusted her. Even in this, his darkest hour, he trusted her. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Valeria rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt his pain, his grief, his rage, but she also felt his love. What do I do now?" he asked, his voice muffled against her hair. "You grieve," Valeria said, her voice soft. "You heal. And then you rebuild. You create a new future. A future free from the lies of the past." Nicolo's grip tightened on her. "And will you be there?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Will you be by my side?" "Always," Valeria said, her voice firm. "I will always be by your side." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises, with unspoken hopes, with unspoken love. The fragile threads of trust had been tested, stretched to their breaking point, but they had held. And in that holding, they had become stronger. The reckoning with the past was far from over, but they had taken the first step, the most difficult step. And they had taken it together. The future was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but they would face it together. As husband and wife. As partners. As lovers. The truth had been revealed. And the healing could begin. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably. The letter lay on the desk, a testament to the past. But their future was yet to be written. And they would write it together. On a clean slate. Free from the lies. Free from the betrayals. Free from the darkness. The fragile threads of trust were now unbreakable bonds. Forged in fire.
Tempered by pain.
And strengthened by love. They had found each other. In the darkness. And now, they would walk together towards the light. Whatever that light might be. Wherever it might lead. They were ready. Together. Always. The storm had passed. And a new dawn was breaking. A dawn of hope. Of healing. Of love. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The revelation of his father's betrayal sent Niccolò into a spiral of grief and rage. He withdrew from Valeria, from the world, locking himself in his study, refusing to eat, to sleep, to speak. Valeria understood his need for solitude, his need to process the devastating truth, but she also worried about him, about the darkness that seemed to consume him. She tried to reach him, to offer comfort, but he remained distant, his emotions locked down behind a wall of pain. She knew that she couldn't force him to open up, that she had to wait for him to come to her, to be ready to share his burden. Meanwhile, the threat from the Baroness loomed large. With Niccolò incapacitated, the responsibility for managing the family's affairs fell to Valeria. She stepped into the role with a newfound strength and determination, drawing on the knowledge she had gained, the lessons she had learned from Niccolò and from her own family's hidden history. She met with Niccolò's lieutenants, reviewed strategic plans, and made difficult decisions, all while maintaining a calm and confident facade. She discovered that she had a knack for leadership, a talent for negotiation, and a surprising ability to command respect. But she also knew that her power was precarious, that it depended on Niccolò's eventual return, on his reclaiming his position as head of the family. And she feared that the longer he remained withdrawn, the more vulnerable they became. One evening, as Valeria was working late in Niccolò's study, she heard a noise behind her. She turned and saw Niccolò standing in the doorway, his face haggard, his eyes haunted, but also different, somehow. Clearer, more focused. "Niccolò," she said softly, rising from the chair. He didn't speak, simply walked towards her, his gaze intense. He stopped in front of her, his hands reaching out to cup her face. "Valeria," he said, his voice hoarse. I have been lost." "I know," Valeria said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you're back now." Niccolò nodded, his eyes searching hers. I have been a fool," he said. "I have let the past consume me. I have shut you out. I have forgotten what is important." "It's all right, Niccolò," Valeria said, her voice soft. "You needed time." Niccolò shook his head.
"No," he said.
I needed you.
You are my strength, Valeria.
My light. My love." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with emotion. It was a kiss of apology, of gratitude, of renewed commitment. When they finally broke apart, Niccolò's expression was determined. "I am ready now," he said, his voice firm. "Ready to face the future. Ready to fight for what is ours." "And what about your father?" Valeria asked, her voice hesitant. "What about the past?" Niccolò's eyes darkened. "The past is dead," he said, his voice cold. "My father is dead. I will honor his memory as dawn. But I will not let his actions define me. I will forge my own path. A path of justice."
"And of peace."
Valeria's heart leaped with hope. He was back. The man she loved, the man she had believed in, was back. And he was stronger, more determined than ever. The final confrontation with the Baroness came swiftly, brutally. Niccolò, with Valeria by his side, orchestrated a series of strategic moves, outmaneuvering his enemies, isolating them, and ultimately, forcing them into a final, decisive battle. The battle was fought on the docks, a place of darkness and violence, a place where the Moretti family had long held sway. Valeria, against Niccolo's initial objections, insisted on being present, on standing by his side, on sharing the risk, the danger. She watched as Niccolo led his men, his face a mask of cold determination, his movements precise and deadly. She saw the violence, the bloodshed, the raw brutality of the conflict. But she also saw the loyalty, the courage, the unwavering commitment of the men who fought for him, for their family, for their future. And she saw Niccolo, not just as a capo, a ruthless leader, but as a man fighting for what he believed in, fighting for his love, fighting for her. The battle raged, and for a time, the outcome was uncertain. But in the end, the Morettis, strengthened by their alliance with the Marquesses, prevailed. The Baroness were defeated, their leader killed, their power shattered. As the smoke cleared and the bodies were removed, Niccolo stood on the docks, his clothes stained with blood, his face grim, but his eyes triumphant. He looked at Valeria, his expression softening. "It is over," he said, his voice weary but relieved. Valeria walked towards him, her heart filled with a mixture of horror and pride. She had witnessed the darkness of his world, the violence he was capable of, but she had also seen his strength, his courage, his love. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers wiping away a streak of blood. "It is a new beginning," she said, her voice soft. Niccolo nodded, his gaze locking with hers. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his body trembling. "We did it, Valeria," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We won." "We did," Valeria said, her voice firm. "Together." The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had been fought. And love had triumphed. Over darkness. Over violence. Over the past. The docks were silent, except for the lapping of the waves. The future was still uncertain. But they would face it together. As husband and wife. As partners. As lovers. Always. The battle was over. But their journey continued. A journey towards a new dawn. A dawn of peace. Of hope. Of love. A love that had been forged in fire. And tempered by the ultimate test. The final confrontation. Of hearts. And of loyalties. And they had both chosen each other. Above all else. And that was all that mattered. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the docks. A new day. A new beginning. A new life. Together. Forever.
Epilogue.
5 years later, the Villa Moretti, perched high on the cliffs overlooking the turquoise waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea, was filled with the sounds of laughter and life. Valeria, her dark hair now streaked with silver, sat on the terrace, a glass of chilled limoncello in her hand, watching her 2 children play in the gardens below. Alessandro, a dark-haired, blue-eyed boy of 4, was chasing his younger sister, Eleanor, a mischievous 3-year-old with her father's strong will and her mother's gentle spirit. Niccolo, his face softened by time and love, stood beside Valeria, his arm around her waist, his gaze following the children with a mixture of pride and contentment. The scars of his past were still there, etched on his face, woven into his soul, but they no longer defined him. He was a husband, a father, a leader who had chosen a different path, a path of peace, of prosperity, of love. The Moretti family, once synonymous with violence and fear, had become a symbol of stability and strength. Niccolo, guided by Valeria's wisdom and compassion, had transformed the family business, diversifying into legitimate ventures, investing in the community, and forging alliances with former rivals. The old ways of the mafia were fading, replaced by a new era of cooperation and progress. Marco, Valeria's brother, had been exiled, sent to America with a generous allowance and a stern warning to stay away from Sicily. He had, predictably, squandered his money and his opportunities, but he was no longer a threat to the Moretti family, to their peace, to their future. Isabella, Valeria's aunt, was a frequent visitor to the villa, her sharp wit and wise counsel a constant source of support and guidance. She had become a surrogate grandmother to Alessandro and Eleanor, sharing stories of their family's history, both the dark and the light, instilling in them a sense of pride, of responsibility, of legacy. Valeria often thought about the journey that had brought her to this place, the twists and turns, the trials and tribulations, the love and loss that had shaped her life. She had been a pawn, a sacrifice, a prisoner, but she had also become a queen, a leader, a lover. She had found her strength, her voice, her purpose. And she had found love. A love that was fierce, passionate, enduring. A love that had defied the odds, that had overcome the darkness, that had transformed both her and Niccolò. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the sea, Niccolò leaned down and kissed Valeria, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of 1,000 shared moments, of 1,000 unspoken promises. "I love you, Valeria," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I love you, Niccolò," Valeria replied, her voice soft but firm. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, watching the children play, listening to the sounds of laughter and life that filled their home. The scars of the past were still there, but they were healing. And in their place, a new tapestry was being woven, a tapestry of love, of family, of hope. The future was still uncertain, as it always is, but they would face it together, as husband and wife, as partners, as lovers, always. The villa, once a symbol of power and fear, was now a home, a sanctuary, a place of peace. And it was all thanks to a choice made in the face of darkness, a choice fueled by love, a love that had conquered all, a love that would endure forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. A perfect Sicilian sunset. A perfect ending to a not-so-perfect beginning, but an ending that was filled with hope, with promise, with love. A love that would last a lifetime and beyond. The children ran towards them, their laughter echoing through the gardens. Life went on, beautifully, imperfectly, but always together. That was the Moretti family now. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The night embraced them, stars appearing one by one. And in that embrace, they found their peace. Their forever. Their love. The end.